missed anything. We're just having a little chit chat here. We're talking about climate change in Phoenix, where Dr. Lin-Hendel lives, in Hawaii, where Dr. Gupta lives. Since it is 8:05 now, I think it's best that we get started, and then we'll just continue to, let people in the coming couple minutes or so. So welcome to everybody who is able to join. Thank you so much for coming in. This is the AAVMP Intersectional AAPI Pride Month webinar. We're extremely excited to have two really fantastic people here that will be sharing their life experience with us today. I'm Yui Shepard. I'm the Educational Director for AAVMP. And then we have Dr. Erika Lin-Hendel here, who goes by they, them. And then Dr. Sumeet Gupta as well here. And they will both each introduce themselves in just a second. Before we get started, I do also want to give a shout out to our sponsors, VCA, Banfield, and IndieVets, for allowing this to happen today. So without further ado, I would love to pass on the mic, and we'll have Dr. Erika Lin-Hendel begin sharing us her stories.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Erika, and I am a multiracial Taiwanese, German, first-generation American living in Phoenix. I practice small animal medicine, doing relief work mostly. And I also do a lot of educational work and consulting in DEI space. I am pansexual, queer, non-binary, gender fluid. There are a whole bunch of different words that I use to articulate what my experience is. And this is actually something that I came into later in life. And we'll get into that in more detail, but I'm really excited to be here, and I'm super excited to get the opportunity to be joined by Dr. Sumeet Gupta. And I'll pass it off to you, and then after your introduction, we'll just do some baseline introductory info about LGBTQI identity.
Thanks, Dr. Lin-Hendel. I really appreciate being asked to speak here today and share my stories. My name is Sumeet Gupta. I'm a first-generation Indian American. My parents immigrated from India in 1977 to Kentucky. They later moved to Illinois, where I was born. And then we moved to California, where I claim as my home state, but technically not. But my formative years, I developed my formative years in California, and I went to undergrad out there. And after undergrad, I went to Ohio State University for vet school. I graduated and moved back to Los Angeles and worked for 7 years in Los Angeles, did an internship. I managed an overnight emergency hospital in central LA and did a GP exotics and emergency exotics as well. I met my husband and we moved to New York City, and I was working for IDEXX Laboratories as a professional services veterinarian, which entails providing education, or best way to describe it is being an educational resource or scientific resource for the IDEXX field team, but also IDEXX veterinarians who may not understand the nuances of what this parameter means or how to interpret this result or what is the next diagnostic step. And so my role there was providing education to all members of the hospital, including doctors and hospital owners, in order to create a deeper understanding. And my goal in that one was really to impact more pets by impacting more vets. So classic example was something like SDMA. After 2 years in New York, we decided to move. The pandemic was pretty tough out there, and we moved to Hawaii, where I am back in general practice. I do general practice and exotics, and I do speak on the side here and there. One of these, like AAVMP, I speak on a topic that is very dear to my heart, and I didn't truly understand what that topic was, but until only a year ago, 2 years ago. But it's how we as a veterinarian group communicate with our client base when there is a high likelihood that our background, the way that we were brought up, the languages that we speak, the religions that we practice, may not and probably won't reflect that of the general pet owning public. And so are we effectively communicating to the clients in ways that are authentic to them for their compliance, right, to make our jobs easier, to make the pets get better, faster, but I think also had a public health component to that. And so that's, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but that's sort of my background.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We collectively kind of discussed one of the important things about a forum discussion that can be missed is actually some basic groundwork or basic information. So we all know that we're approaching the new information or the personal information that we're getting from the same foundation. So with some of the work that Pride BMC does, I wanted to just kind of talk a little bit about intersectional identity and where it comes. So for the month of June, as far as a really timely aspect of conversation around Pride Month, we're talking about LGBTQ plus community. And LGBTQ plus is just one of the acronyms that is used. It's an umbrella term to describe a diverse community of marginalized relationship, gender, sex, sexual identities outside of cisgender. That means identifying as the same gender as you were born. Heterosexual, meaning of traditionally viewed as man and woman relationships. And this includes gender identity, gender expression, relationship styles, and at the bottom I have several different acronyms that are used around the world. So for example, 2S or Two-Spirit is another one that is an indigenous term for non-binary identities. And so what we come across most frequently, lesbian, gay, bisexual are included. Transgender and non-binary identity are represented within T, and Q is usually meant to be queer or questioning. And I'll talk a little bit more about why queer is a term that so many people enjoy using, and I can share a little bit about why I choose to use queer. And then it is debated whether or not the plus sign is inclusive or exclusive or reductive, but it is used very frequently in other spaces. Intersex, which is represented by the I, is also centered because intersex human rights are really also very important. And so why people sometimes use queer is because it's descriptive of many individuals. However, not all people within LGBTQ plus identify as queer. So it's really kind of a personal thing. Also for other reasons is that at one point or another, queer was utilized as a slur. And so for people who are of elder generation, sometimes this word is actually really difficult to navigate, whereas in other people, it's been a reclaimed term. For me personally, why I choose to use queer is that there's a certain amount of very personal and intimate aspects of myself and my identity that are utilized in specific words. And I don't owe it to anyone necessarily to share the specifics of what that is, whether or not it's about my romantic relationships or my gender identity. And so for me, I feel very comfortable in utilizing queer, and it feels empowering because it gives me the space that I need to navigate this of something that I have ownership of in a personal way. Within this context, we have gender diverse community. And so as a non-binary human, and also with a lot of the work that Pride VMC is doing around gender identity. It's just something that I wanted to bring up briefly. And the thing that I would say is most important is that the way that gender identity is expressed and all of the things around it and all of the ways and biases that can exist, we can consider gender diverse community as basically anyone who crosses over or challenges society's traditional gender roles and or expression. And this often, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit, often can involve discrimination and unfortunately violence. Okay, so here's just another visual. I'm going to skip through this, but in general, we have on the left, just a point to say non-binary individuals, although they can be considered included under transgender identities and not identifying with the sex or gender that you were assigned at birth, that might not be what a non-binary individual might not identify as trans. The other component that I'd like to note about this is that this is from the internet, right? So this is just an emphasizes that in a lot of, as a profession, we're very much science-based and want to look at a lot of publications. And one of the things around queer identity and mental health is that academics sometimes have not caught up to where modern thought leaders are. So that's just something to keep in mind for people who are on their journey exploring this space. So now we shift to intersectionality, kind of one of the main reasons why we're here today, talking about where queer identity, LGBTQ+ identity, and other marginalized identities such as race and ethnicity, and more. We could talk about disability, we could talk about other aspects and how they come together in an individual's experience. And so both Dr. Gupta and I can't separate our heritage and being people of color from also our queerness. And some of the conversations that we have later today might reflect some of that. But it's really important to know that the civil rights movement for LGBTQ+ individuals was started with intersectional identity, with trans women of color. Were people who were instrumental in fighting for the civil rights that we enjoy today, and the civil rights that we have to continue to fight for. In general, it's important to recognize how the intersection of queerness and gender identity and how that plays a role in some of the other issues that we face around race, ethnicity, mental health care access, and getting both appropriate mental health care, appropriate diagnoses, appropriate support, appropriate access, and also this component of the fact that immigrant stories are also a very big part of identity. And lastly, and this is clearly my non-binary bias coming to play, is that the erasure of non-binary and trans identity and queer identity has its roots in colonialism. I'll say that again. The erasure of the history of queer and non-binary and trans identities, especially from coming from communities of color, the erasure is based in colonialism. And so I think that when we talk about intersectional identities, racism is a part of it, colonialism is a part of it. And so that is kind of the, in a nutshell, encompasses some of the things that are important facets of our conversation today and kind of the personal perspectives that we may or may not cover in the discussion that we have today. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop. And thank you for sitting through that introduction. I think that's very important for grounding. And Mel, thank you so much for that statement of support.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lin-Hendel. I think I speak for everybody when I say that that was extremely informative. And I see here Mel is thanking you for mentioning two-spirit. I will also say I feel like just because of the theme of the night, I do identify, or I guess the best way is that I am in the questioning section. My sister, who they have told me that I can continue to call them sister, did recently explore the idea of non-binary with me. And so they have helped me navigate what that means. And something that I tend to forget is that just because one identify as being part of the LGBTQ plus community or in the umbrella doesn't necessarily mean that they're the expert either. And so I think that helped me kind of see that I'm not trying to be an imposter. I was kind of feeling like a bit of an imposter syndrome when I started experimenting with the pronoun she, they, which I've had it for at least a couple months on my LinkedIn profile, and I've been very comfortable with it, and no one's come up to me to threaten my identity. So yeah, I just wanted to share that with you guys here, since this just feels like a very safe space. And as well, for all of our participants, if you guys do want to share anything, just feel free to speak up. We're just trying to keep this as organic as possible. And so with the next series, I do want to go over some questions that we have for our two wonderful people here today. But to our participants, if you guys have any questions that come up, and Dr. Kaori Sakamoto have mentioned this in the chat, feel free to jump in. If you're shy to just, interrupt us midway through, then you can put in your questions in the chat box and we'll get through to it. And I do want to prioritize you guys' questions. Okay. So what I'll do is I'm going to start asking the question. We can maybe start with Dr. Gupta answering, and then we can have then Dr. Lin-Hendel answer the same questions. So first of all, Dr. Gupta, what has it been like for you, both growing up in an Asian household, knowing that you didn't fit into that cis hetero narrative?
Yeah, I was definitely like the oddball out. So I grew up in Rockford, Illinois, which at the time was a very suburban city, third biggest city in the state of Illinois, 2 hours from Chicago. And I lived on a street with all boys. Like every house, everybody had boys. This was like quintessential Midwest. All the kids hang out, they play in the street during the daytime or after school. See each other every day, play baseball, play football. And I did do those sports and stuff, but I think it was quite obvious. Even after my parents and I told my uncle that I was gay and getting married to a man, my uncle, who lives in India, and they were very concerned about his reaction. He said, yeah, we always knew that he was different. I think I was very fortunate in my circumstance where I think everybody kind of saw it from far away and let me be the way that I was instead of forcing me to do X, Y, and Z. I think everybody has to play a sport at some point in their life, mostly. Everybody has to play an instrument at some point in their life. But it's weird. You walk between these two lines of, it's like being Asian American. You walk on this line where you're like, okay, I know American stuff and I know Asian stuff, but you never know them well enough, especially if you come from a first generation family where like my parents didn't listen to certain music. So when I went to school or college and I hear a song, I'm like, I never heard that song before. So you end up living this alternative. It's like an alternative reality in some sense. Like you are there present with everybody else in the world, but what you're experiencing, no one else is experiencing. And we can say that as Asian Americans. I think we can say that as LGBTQ plus individuals. And with the intersectionality, I think it does make it twofold. But I think that's maybe the best way to describe it. Did I forget half of the question? Okay.
I was just gonna say, Dr. Gupta, I definitely like relate a lot as far as immigrant upbringing, which I think is very common within like the Asian veterinary experience. I mean, it's a lot of us are children of immigrants, and that has a very specific and nuanced experience on that, and what type of culture we interface with. So I grew up in a like a mixed race family. My dad is German and my mother is Taiwanese. And my mom was fairly unconventional. She came to the United States to get her PhD in physics. And so she was very much working in a male-dominated field. And I think there was a little bit of space for me to be unconventional as well. And so being pansexual, what does that mean? It means that I love in a way that I don't pay attention to gender. So for me, it was actually growing up, I didn't actually recognize or connect with my queerness until later in life, is because around me there was just kind of like this continuous narrative of heteronormativity, and I didn't necessarily recognize. I think people say like, oh yes, like the female form is something that everyone appreciates, right? So the romantic feelings that I had for people who weren't, who were not like mask gendered, like I just didn't even process that as something that had meaning. And so it was something that when I connected with my queerness later in life, I was like, oh, everything makes more sense. So it's a very much a reflection back. And I think that this is very common for people who are bisexual or pansexual to have that uncertainty and that needing at times time to like really come into it, because there are a lot of people pushing that narrative, especially because we live in a culture that is very focused on like monogamous dyadic, which means two people, relationships. And so a lot of people might be in cis heterosexual presenting relationships, but be queer, right? And they don't have to justify that to anyone, right? And so the other component for me, I would say, is that my parents, I was gender fluid from the beginning. When I was very young, about like 3, I told my parents that my name was Eric, and that I only wanted to wear boy clothes and played with trucks and all sorts of things. And my parents decided to just let me do my thing. And I eventually, like, came to terms with what society, inferred about gender at, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7, but continued in this space of shifting between femme and masc presenting and feelings, because gender is a concept that doesn't make sense to me. And that might be because I'm autistic, but it just doesn't compute. And so I think that I probably kind of came into it all at once. When I was actually in a cis heteronormative marriage, and when that ended and I parted ways, and I was able to really ask myself, what life do I want to have? Like, if I am actually free of all expectations, and I am really just being true to myself, what does that actually mean? And that was when I was able to kind of fully embody and connect with those aspects of my personality. And I'm much happier for it. Oh, awesome. Thank you for that information, autogender and newer term. That is something that I'm going to have to take a look into. But yeah, I think that my parents were not particularly supportive when I was young. There were times where I found out from other sources that they were afraid of me being queer. They were afraid that I was in a relationship with my college roommate. And that came out in conflict, although there were not very specific conversations about it. But I will say that being like a femme Asian human, sexuality is rife with complexity. And that comes from the fetishization of Asian women, basically. And so it was a very complex space. And we probably delved into like non-binary identity and links to responses to societal pressures and trauma and that kind of thing. But that's neither here nor there. That's like, we could talk about that another day.
Yeah, this conversation topic there's just so much intersectionality and connection with so many other issues that absolutely we could just continue to expand. But thank you, Dr. Gupta and Dr. Lin-Hendel, for sharing your stories. I feel like both of you are.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Oh,
I was just going to say is that, sorry, because of the delay, we keep talking. I was just going to say every story is different for each individual that we've been through. And it's really important to know that like these are our stories and the things that we've experienced, but it may not apply to the next person that may identify with the same terms that especially Dr. Lin-Hendel may use more newer terms or more gender neutral terms. I don't want to say anything offensive, so I'm like trying not to ramble. And so just keep that in mind, is that everyone's story is different, and the way that people relate to the terminology that they're using for themselves may be different, even though it might be the same term. Just wanted to make sure we put that out there.
Dr. Lin-Hendel, did you want to add something? I was just going to say 100%, right? And that's actually why when I said pansexual, I defined it for myself. So that's something that can be, that's something that's very important to know, is that you can invite somebody like to give you more information if they don't offer it, but that is completely up to them. right? That's another component of any aspect of someone's story. If you are hoping to create space to share more or have a dialogue, that it has to be an invitation, and that no one is obligated to share any of those details with anyone.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with both of you. And thank you, Dr. Gupta, again, for bringing that up. I think we also, as human beings, tend to want to put people in a label or in a box to understand them, even if it comes from the best intention. That can definitely be harmful for those who have been in the LGBTQ plus community and have been mislabeled their entire life or been pushed into a label they don't identify with. So it's definitely something that I feel like is probably a lifelong learning, at least for myself, as well as probably others. And then the other thing I've kind of realized from both of your story is that you both are technically first generation. So I can imagine there was probably an additional hardship that came with that. I don't know how it is in Indian culture, but at least in East Asian or Japanese culture, sex is also a topic of taboo. People, family don't talk about it. I'm, 36 years old, but I still am very uncomfortable talking to my mother about anything related to that. And I don't think I'll ever be comfortable again. I see Dr. Lin-Hendel laughing and nodding. I don't know if you agree. Romani culture is like Indian, that too.
For Indian culture, I guess I will say is I had a very different upbringing than most of the Indian American people I knew. So my parents ran away and had a love marriage and moved to the United States. They came from two different religions, and we spoke primarily English at home. I can understand Hindi, but I am not great at speaking it. And so growing up, our parents sort of, I wouldn't say we were Westernized or Americanized, but we sort of blended the two as well as they could. So it wasn't easy for my parents. In retrospect, there was a lot of, I think it was more fear for safety. I think a lot of that stems from they come here for a purpose. They come here knowing, or X, Y, and Z. These are the only things that are going to make you successful. Anything that deviates from this path can be bad. And I think that unknown of what that bad is more scary than the outcomes, right? Like, look at where we are now. But I don't talk about sexual intercourse with my parents. I never would. I do know some people who do, not Indian people, but people who talk to their parents are more open about it than I would feel comfortable. But I do think it's very taboo. There's like a prim and proper type of, this is what you talk about and this is what you don't. So, yes, that's the same. Is that the answer to the question? Sorry.
Yeah. I think that there was definitely, like, both of my parents came from very conservative upbringing, and so there were very clear gender roles, and there were also very clear gender roles and racism that were showing up in the home, with my dad having a very traditional European methodology, of which still we butt heads against each other a lot in that space. And with my mom kind of assuming a lot of both the traditional gender roles and also going out and working in a male-dominated field and utilizing strategy of gender and expression to navigate those spaces. And so I think to basically talk about like the journey or the arc that my parents and I took in talking about like where I'm coming from. And what Dr. Gupta said is like they come here with this idea of what it is to be successful or what is going to make life easier. And that is what they wanted for me. They wanted me to have something that was going to be what they viewed or perceived as easier. And I remember my dad, this was after my divorce, being like, I just want you to have like a normal life where you settle down and have like a house and husband and some kids. And I understood like the love that was in that statement, but I had to just remind him, being like, I never was interested in, I say conventional, I don't necessarily think that that's like an appropriate thing to call it, but to say the dominant culture or like the most common thing, like I always kind of rebelled against it a little bit. So I think that they have, like, when I came out to them, I thought, you know, it was like a big argument. My dad hung up the phone on me, and I was like, well, this is already a dumpster fire. Let me just come out to my parents. And I was like, I was going to do this on the phone, but you hung up on me. So I just figured I'm just going to tell you, guess what? I'm queer and non-binary. And then like my mom was like, what does that actually mean? Which was probably the most delightful mom thing that I was just like, that's great. Like, as far as I was concerned, we don't really talk about it a whole lot. I think they're just getting like more accustomed to like the idea of how I navigate romantic spaces and relational spaces in my life. Now that it's a little bit more open, as far as at least about romantic spaces, like I think that they are more at peace and they see me being happier, right? Yeah.
That's good to hear. And I'm glad that, yeah, go for it, Dr. Gupta.
I'm sorry, but I feel like you brought something really great up, is that with time, it will get better, right? Like, I think for our parents, like you said, they come here with this rigid expectation of what success is. And I don't think their plans go according to plan, right? Like, and everything doesn't fall in line for them while they're here. And I think it's difficult for them to lose things that they know, because they know that that is good, but they don't know something else may be good too, or better for an individual. And so I've been married 2.5, 3 years now, and my parents, I will occasionally hear them telling their friends, they're like, oh, this is Sumeet's friend. And I'm like, you mean my husband? And everybody knows that's what they mean. But I think, I don't think it's a language thing. I do think it's like a deeper down comfort level about the titles that they're placing on people or whatever, their extended family, that they still aren't 100% comfortable on. I mean, my parents have come leaps and bounds since I came out, and I've had it pretty easy coming out. But it does take time, and I think it's really important to understand that they need that time. As much as we need them to be ready for us right then and there, they also need that time because of the things they've been through in their life. And so, I don't know, I'm rambling again, but I think that really struck a chord with me, as you said, like, it takes time, because I thought about, yeah, they still call him my friend sometimes. And does hurt ever so slight, right? But I also keep in mind, I'm like, it's, I think, easier for them to do that than to break this like barrier in their brain or in their mind that's like they can't go beyond that and say husband to a male individual. So
Yeah, I do think that especially being immigrant coming into this country and having to adjust in so many ways, and then from their generation, there is also that deep conditioning that is really hard to unwind and unpack. I can imagine that even as much as they love us, they still struggle with the terminology. And I do feel like patience probably is a key factor for everybody involved, even though that's very easier said than done for us. And then I just want to mention Mel, who's been dropping some for just a bunch of pearl of wisdoms here. So Mel also mentioned how they have gotten their very Romani dominated family to break off from rigid gender roles by illustrating the diversity. That diversity has always been there. And I thought that that was such a important perspective. And then they went on to discuss, the quirky uncle that wears eyeliner. So it turns out that they are actually transitioned later in their life, or the tomboy girl turning into a trans older brother or younger brother. That has always been a presence, except it's just never been talked about up until very recently. So thank you so much, Mel. That's a really, really good point. Now, I feel like we could just keep going on about this topic, but I am going to move on because I do want to ask this next question, which I think we all wonder about too. When it comes to vet, in your experience in vet school, how did you both navigate through your veterinary programs and further training? And what has been your experience interacting with your professors and peers? Has it been positive, negative, mix of both? What's been the overall experience?
Dr. Lin-Hendel, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I actually did not come out until after vet school. But what I can say is that in some of the things that I do now, in working with students, I know that there are some places that are really not supportive at all. And, we had students experience an administrator from, I'm just going to go ahead and say it, Texas A&M, who last year sent out an email to the whole student body and the entire community that had a lot of harmful language. And I do think, and there are students, especially trans and non-binary students, that experience a lot of discrimination. I knew of classmates who experienced discrimination, and both like from peers and from professors, and from clinicians. And I think the big thing is that our industry is really needing to make a shift about how we treat each other in general, because it goes beyond just discrimination around marginalized identity. It's we are, a lot of spaces are perpetuating cycles of trauma, basically. And so one of those things that I think is important is to understand that we're whole people. Like it's not just about the medicine, and that for people who say it's just about the medicine, that is a privilege, right? That is a point of privilege. And I have had situations where I have communicated being like, hey, there's a Chick-fil-A right next door, and it makes it difficult for me to get my bearings first thing in the morning. and I made a request that if anyone wants to have a chicken sandwich, I understand that Chick-fil-A is convenient because it's right across there. If the 3 days I'm scheduled to work, if someone wants that, I will go and get you a chicken sandwich down the street from somewhere else. Is that a reasonable thing? No, it wasn't. I got pulled into HR to have a conversation about it. So, like, I think that overall, there's just a lot of ignorance, just plain ignorance, and that ignorance is based in privilege. And I think that if people actually recognized the harm that can be involved, or if they recognize the fact that somebody coming from a marginalized identity background already has other stuff happening in their lives just to get through the door, right? I might experience, something at the grocery store, right? If I am walking around being publicly visible as an example of like queer romantic life, and someone screams something at me or throws something at me, like, that is real. That is a real thing that happens, and that happens to people that I know. So I think that when we have professors being like, well, I don't want to use someone's personal pronouns, or they're going to like willfully misgender somebody, or make homophobic comments, like, I don't know, like there's a lot of work to be done. That's the main statement. There's a lot of work to be done.
You brought out so many more things that I was thinking. I thought about so many more things as you were talking. I think that there is, what we know is that African American individuals who have experienced police force trauma or aggressive policing, they are at higher risks of developing certain cardiovascular diseases. This is some of the research that I pulled out from my cultural epidemiology kind of dive in. And when, not only during the episode of the over-policing or police brutality occurs, but every time the individual relives that experience by telling somebody about it, by thinking about it, by having a nightmare, they have repeated episodes of hypertension. And although short in duration, the frequency is thought to be reasons why certain groups of people who are treated incorrectly or disproportionately worse than other groups of people may have chronic illnesses or a higher likelihood of high cholesterol, or et cetera. And that's a brief summary of the research I did. But I think it's worth noting is that by not using an individual's pronouns, by misgendering them intentionally, these are microaggressors. And these microaggressors are the same things as small little blips in your blood pressure. And they do go on to impact an individual's health over time. And that could end up being years off of their lifespan. So I do think that there is, you have to start being with the times at some point in time. You can't stay in the past because the past is gone. And I do think there's a lot of individuals at all institutions, they don't have to be only academic, but government institutions that are, we can just talk about the veterinary profession. But I do think there are a lot of people who've been in longstanding positions who don't want to change, but without changing, they're holding everybody else back. And all the micro stressors, if it's just towards POC or BIPOC and LGBT, that's not true. It's then against women or it's against X, Y, and Z. So those people go on to potentially do it to other groups of people just as much. That being said, my experience in navigating all of my education and post-veterinary education and training, I came out to my parents and everybody at school and high school my freshman year. And I did receive harassing phone calls, etc., a couple of times throughout high school. I think I was fairly lucky. It really didn't happen too often. And I don't know if it's nature versus nurture, but I've always been outgoing, talkative, extroverted, bubbly, cheery. And so throughout college, I really found or came into my own about like owning my gayness. And I think that there's a power it gave me. And so by being more confident in that and who I am and knowing where I didn't want to go to a school that didn't want LGBTQ plus students. So there were certain questions on the applications, right? They're like, what do you bring to diversity? They had a couple questions when I applied. And so I was like, I'm gay, I'm Indian, first generation American. Like I put everything out there because I was like, you know what? I don't want to have to pay to go for an interview if they don't want me. So I'm just putting all that stuff out there. And if they don't want me, that's totally fine because I don't want to go there. And I think to a certain degree, yes, you don't want to go there. But if there's 24 veterinary schools in the country or in North America, and it's changed now, but do you have that same choice? If this is the only thing you can imagine yourself doing as a profession or as a career, do you still have that same choice to say, I don't want to go to a school that doesn't want me because of one percentage of who I am? And I do think that that's unfair. I do think to a certain degree, maybe it played in my favor for certain universities that were looking to diversify their student population. But to the school I went to, I don't think I diversified the population much more than it was already diversified, which is still low, but diversity, we can talk about that maybe in a future one, or we can do like a summary page, but diversity is like a metric. So diversity is something you can measure. Like what is your demographic of the individuals that work there or are there? And then there's inclusion, there's equity and belonging. I do recommend everybody look those up. But I think that from my perspective, I was really lucky to get into a university that was pretty open and comfortable. I would say there was one rotation, large animal rotation, that no female student could go to this one particular dairy farm because the dairy farmer that owned that farm did not think women were capable of being veterinarians. So they would go in the car or in the truck to the dairy farm. And if you were a girl on that rotation, you would stay in the car and only the boys would go with the male clinicians. So you're paying money to receive an education. There's a certain degree in which if the university doesn't defend you as a student, then why would you want to go there? Like I said, sometimes you don't have an option. I know that it's happened to other people on rotations based on different parameters of their backgrounds. So I think because I'm so forthright and like not in your face about it, but I'm not hiding it. And I don't think individuals would had tried to like push my buttons or push me to the side because of being Indian American or gay. And the same thing goes for like the internship. And then even in my career, I think even at IDEXX, I was the eccentric gay one because there's only 24 PhDs, and I was pretty outspoken and had slightly different approach to how I did or completed the role or performed the role. But I do think in some fashion, they saw it as a value add, that they're like, maybe I am the diversity token individual, and they're like, we got one. But they did see how I leveraged certain parts of my personality that may be eccentric to some, but would work great in an educational format of presentations, right? Keep it entertaining, keep it moving. So I think I was lucky and able to kind of flip that over to a positive for me for a majority of my life. And like I said, like my parents, I would say I'm not the norm for many of these experiences. I think I was just extremely, extremely lucky in the way that my parents were and their relationship and how they came here and coming out so early and really maybe being in California made it easier. I don't know. I will say is one thing I did here, and my jaw dropped when somebody told me this. So my husband's African American, and one of his friends told me that I had Indian privilege, and I had never heard that before. But when she explained it to me, I was like, okay, I'm not mad at it, because originally I was kind of offended. But because being Asian American and being Indian American, there's a certain connotation within the larger American culture of the roles that we will perform. So in the Civil Rights Act of 1965, there was an Immigration Act that allowed certain individuals from non-European countries to immigrate to the United States with high qualifying degrees. So doctors, lawyers, engineers. My dad is an engineer. That's how my parents came over. And so one individual at Ohio State, she's Indian American, and her dad is a doctor, but when he came to the United States, he got placed. I don't know if it was a placement type thing, but he got assigned to West Virginia. So I have another intern mate who her father is a doctor in West Virginia. So what the American culture knows about Asian Americans in a short period of time from 1965 to present are individuals who perform essential function for small and rural towns, large cities, right? Like being doctors, being engineers, being lawyers. And so the African American community was further set back by the Civil Rights Act and the Immigration Act because they leveraged all these Asians coming from Asia and look how successful they've become. But African Americans have been here forever, the entire history of the United States, and have not kind of broken out of their kind of socioeconomic status. And so there is a certain degree as when we walk through certain spaces, right? The connotations change now that COVID has been correlated with a certain type of country. After 9/11, many Indian Americans felt very scared about going out in public or being seen after dark somewhere, uncomfortable. And so over time, the connotation does change, but I think if you think the early 90s, there were very few roles that they would assign to Asian Americans. Now it has expanded significantly. But that was one thing that shocked me, and I did want to make sure I brought that up today because I think without having been told it, I would have never recognized it. But it is quite evident that when they see Gupta at the end of my name, I think there's usually a sigh of relief. They're like, oh, okay, it's Gupta, so they're Indian, they must be a doctor, right? Like, it's such a common last name, but I think it reminds them of something safe or part of the community, or play an essential role in the community.
Yeah, I think that, so it's been dropped in the chat here, the model minority myth, right? So like there's definitely this component that exists as far as specifically for a lot of Asian Americans, that this is part of the conversation that results in a divide, right? Like it's a strategy of white supremacy to divide marginalized individuals instead of, because once we get together and start collaborating, that's when we have more collective power and bargaining power, right? So yeah, I think it's very interesting because for me, in later on in my career, so I worked in swine for 4.5 years. And I did not feel safe. There was a lot of components of being multiracial. It's this component, like, I think if I had like $1 for every time someone was like, what are you? Or like, you know, what's your heritage? I would be able to go on a very nice vacation. And it was something that I was very kind of accustomed to. And it really, oh, thank you for joining us, Amber. It really kind of increased a little bit living in the Midwest, working in swine, because it just didn't look like anyone that they had very much encountered or come across before. And that's where a lot of like toxic gender dynamics came out. So I did not come out as non-binary while working in swine. Nope. And that you know, that's my personal experience, right? Like there is queer representation in swine. There's queer leadership in swine veterinary medicine. I would say, and this is my personal opinion, that it is tokenized to a certain extent. And I would say that more people are not comfortable being out than there are people who are contributing to visibility, which is very important and essential. And so for me, when I decided that I wasn't going to stay in swine, it was fundamentally more of an issue around experiencing racism and like gendered racist misogyny and in subtle ways. And I would say is that because there is a unconscious bias around femme Asians, right? And that is obedience, being demure, being calm. And so when you look like that and you instead question or challenge or express boundaries, there is a distinct reaction that is different and often more punitive. And how do you tell someone, or how do you show that there is unconscious bias or racism at play when it is literally how should I say, indoctrinated? Like, people are raised with this, and if you just go out and you look at imagery, right, what type of imagery around Asian American sexuality there is represented in pop culture. You know, even let's say if you look at films, how Asian women are represented, right? It's very specific and it's everywhere. And so I would say that I think it comes, I think that it really comes down to where are you in space? What is the education of people about these topics? How much unlearning has been done? I know that for me, like, I have learned that visibility is important. I remember the first time I had a mentor, like a mentor that had similar experiences to me, and that was when I got connected with MCVMA, and was like, oh, now I understand this conversation about mentorship. Because up until that point, the quote unquote mentors or the supervisors that I had were all white men. And I still learned, right? I still learned things from them. But was it actually would it cut like to the level of what I actually thought was mentorship? No, because they had a completely different lived experience. And so that's something that I would say is so important about the work that affinity organizations are doing today, is starting to create connections between people, right? So we're not, in isolation, right? Wherever we are, we're not the only people in the room anymore. We can go to a room where there are more common stories, and where students can connect with mentorship that actually has some of the lived experience in parallel, can, if not empathize, at least sympathize from a place of knowledge. That makes a huge difference, because practicing medicine is really hard. Right? Navigating veterinary medicine is really hard. Doing that on top of all of this other stuff is, to be honest, even harder.
This thought keeps leaving my brain, and I already lost it. I'll think about it and jump back in.
No worries. Yeah, there's just so much that I want to continue dissecting, but I think there's a lot of duality in our existence, where we are a model minority, but at the same time we do have the privilege of other BIPOC communities, but also at the same time our hurt in our experience is legitimate and absolutely justified as well. Mel here has also mentioned in vet and med, their gender seems to be questioned or insulted with racism. And that does make me think that, especially from my experience too, in farm animal medicine, not only are those who look femme looked down upon by a lot of people in the field, made assumption of our physical strength, our ability to do things, even sometimes our intelligence as well, even though our field is majority people who at least identify or assume to be identified as female. So I completely understand why, Dr. Lin-Hendel, you made the decision to leave swine medicine. And I think that was probably the best decision you could have made for yourself, for your happiness and well-being. So I 100% just want to throw kudos there. And that actually does kind of trickle down to our next question, because I did want to have you guys discuss about your experience in the different field. I know that, Dr. Lin-Hendel had mentioned experience working in the swine medicine. I do want to know if shifting into small animal has, to an extent at least, improved your experience overall. If you feel more understood, or if you feel like maybe there's a little bit more representation. And Dr. Gupta as well, I am curious to know, working in small animal ER, and then working at IDEXX, and now, working in Hawaii. And then I think you also were interested in wildlife as well before going into ER. So I am curious to know, in these different fields, how have you guys been received? What has been your experience there? There's probably no, black and white. This was a great experience. This was a terrible experience. But I do want to know if there's certain advances in certain fields that you may have noticed compared to others.
Yeah, I think so. I will say, like, I do think that there's progress being made across the board. I think that unfortunately, it's just, for me, I was like, it's too slow. Life is short and I want to be happy, right? So, and I want to preserve my emotional bandwidth through the things that contribute to change. And so I am finding that in small medicine. I still run into challenging spaces. And that's why I work more relief and do more consulting work, because I get to select who I work with, right? And people who are looking to work with someone like me know how to find me, right? Or the particular conversations that are happening. It took me exiting a place with very little diversity to understand my value, right? And it also is coupled with me being autistic and the way that I communicate. And I have to do some extra work on the front end in identifying organizations that see the value in the way that I question things and are willing to engage in difficult conversations. And there are plenty of organizations that are not ready to do that. It is very difficult to navigate that in corporate medicine, because there's a lot more focus on incremental change. There's a lot which centers the comfort of dominant culture and continues to perpetuate harm. Like, it's just very like people try and hem and haw about it. They're like, oh, well, we want to, this is why the Gender Identity Bill of Rights is so unconventional, in that we were like unapologetic, right? Unapologetic of saying we are centering non-binary, trans, and gender non-conforming voices, and we are not compromising on that at all, right? And that is the shift that I think is what needs to happen. And there are organizations that are willing to do that, and there are a lot of organizations who aren't. And I can't necessarily say why they're so afraid of it. I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me. But I do think that in small animal medicine, I have been able to find places that are really centering people, right? And I've tried to share this with some organizations that, like, not every hospital has to be designed perfectly for everyone that exists, but it does have to be designed for the people in them, right? So every person who's on your team needs to feel like they belong. And so if on your team you don't currently have like a non-binary Asian American autistic human being, like, it's okay, you don't have to be designed for me, but if I come to you and I'm part of your team, then you better get with the program if it's pointed out that it's falling short. And that's it, right? It's not, I don't think that it's that complicated.
Okay, before I forget, I think it has been ingrained in us as Asian Americans, as immigrants, as not, and I'm not going to say like we're the first of our kind to be in these positions, to be in swine animal medicine, to be at IDEXX, no. But there is so few of us in some of these places that we go, and we don't want to be, I think there's a conscious and a subconscious component to putting up with microaggressions and bad behavior, being tokenized, that we don't want to cause a problem to make it worse for anyone behind us who's coming into these roles. And so it's not that I left IDEXX on any bad terms, but I think that there's sometimes where you see that like something needs to change, and if you haven't, and what I've done hasn't changed anything, then it's time to go. Once again, that's not the case with IDEXX, but I do think in certain scenarios, like you can't continue having yourself being berated for the sake of those behind you, because if you don't stand up for yourself, they won't be expected to stand up for themselves behind you. And so I think there's a very slow change in the demographic of people going to veterinary school. From some individuals, I never met an Indian veterinarian until I graduated. And they all came from India, so I never really, like they immigrated from India as an adult with a veterinary degree and then came to the United States. So it wasn't my story or similar to my story that I could relate to them. And I think the longer time goes by where individuals of diverse communities don't see themselves in the veterinarians they take their pets to, they will never think of that becoming a veterinarian as an opportunity for them. And so are we doing the amount of outreach and communication and providing those good client experiences that create client loyalty? And this is all small animal kind of focus, right? But that create the loyalty of a client to keep coming back to the hospital. Because I'll tell you, in Los Angeles, a lot of the clients that were Spanish speaking would say they went to a vet once, they didn't really have a good experience, and they never went back. And now the pet's 13, no vaccines, et cetera. And so just by ensuring that I had somebody who spoke Spanish scheduled in every shift, we were able to at least make sure that there is some way that we can translate all of the information over to them and make sure that the pet got the care it needs and the pet parents understood that. I do think that the metric of diversity is changing slowly. I do think that as the individuals who are bring the diversity to the table, that doesn't mean we can't feel included, but it will always make us feel like something's missing. And that's sort of what I worked on at IDEXX, was developing the Shades of IDEXX community, which is a community that brings IDEXXers of diverse backgrounds together into a forum once a month so that they can see individuals that look like themselves in their colleagues, rather than maybe sometimes being the only diverse individual on their team. I will say, as a PSV, I was not the only Indian individual or Asian individual. And so it did feel nice to see people like me reflected there, but there is a psychological aspect in which these are also micro traumas, is that you never feel like you truly belong in one category or another. And it's not white or Asian. It can be on so many different dimensions, especially LGBTQ plus or not. So there's, I think part of the way that we were raised as a collective Asian community, once again, there's so many different countries and microcultures within it, is to power through in order to make sure that you leave a good impression, that you can make it easier for the person behind you. And I don't think that that is always the right course, because sometimes people have to be told how bad they're doing for them to actually make the change, instead of being like, yeah, you're okay. That's not encouraging change. And so I think it's a decision everybody has to make for themselves, whether you end up leaving or not. But I guess in the back of my mind, as an Indian American kid who wanted to become a veterinarian and never saw an Indian veterinarian in Illinois or California until I was an adult, I always figured I'd be the only Indian person, and there were 2 at my school. So there are 3 of us total. It was amazing. But I never thought I would have so many colleagues of diverse backgrounds. I actually thought going into vet school there would be less than what I've ended up meeting on this journey. But there's a really great website called datausa.io. This takes U.S. Census data and tax return data and compiles it and can give you information on any profession, including veterinarians, and the gender breakdowns in diversity or ethnic breakdowns. And it's really fascinating to see how much of the veterinary population is one way or another. So I would recommend you check that out. You can see it for all professions. It's really actually a fascinating website, datausa.io. But the amount of this is where it gets tricky for me because I still have trouble understanding this. White, non-Hispanic, and white Hispanics, there's something like 90, 92% of the veterinary population. White Hispanic, I think is like 12 or 15. You'll have to look. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head. Asian Americans are 4% and African Americans are 2% of the veterinarian population. So it gives you an idea of, well, what does a community of veterinarians reflect of the general population? Definitely not the same. But I'm going to end there because I don't want to ramble. And so an active participation in self-editing there.
Thank you so much for all of that. I think that, since we only have a couple minutes left, and really in relation to everything you guys have mentioned, there's really two things that I would love to have an insight from both of you. One is really mental health, and obviously this can be like a whole other webinar series, but with everything that you guys have experienced and gone through in different fields growing up, one question is how have you guys coped with the mental health well-being aspect, just navigating through life with who you are in the field that we are in, rampant with a lot of racism, a lot of different types of phobias? And the other question is sort of, again, connected to that. If you did have any advice for our current and future vet professionals or students, what kind of advice would you give? And also for those who are considering joining our profession.
Dr. Gupta, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think I was at the point where I got burned out. I was managing an overnight hospital, but you have to manage it during the day because nobody's open in the middle of the night for you to do business stuff during the nighttime during your shift. So I burned myself out managing a hospital, probably too early out of school to be managing as well. And I think the most important thing that I took away from that was I never wanted to be so afraid of making a change that I'd never made it. And sometimes the changes are hard, but staying where you are is even harder. Just because you know what that day is going to bring you doesn't make it any better for you to stay. And sometimes you have to get up and go. And if it's the difference between staying and your life, you should go. Like, get up and walk away. It's perfectly okay. Everybody has the self-determined right to change their mind. Every human being can change their mind, and so can you. And so that's what I did, is I broke up with my partner of 7 years. I quit my job that I was managing a hospital, super successful. I turned it around. Like, it was doing so good. I moved from Los Angeles back in with my parents, and I got a new job in San Diego, and I kind of started all over for a hot minute. Actually, 4 months later, I moved back to LA. But without doing that, I would have never met my husband now. So I think you have to not be afraid of making a change, even though the change may seem very scary. And then the second piece of advice is, I think a lot of people go around the world, and when you're asked to describe yourself, you may say, I'm an Asian American veterinarian, blah, blah, blah. But this article said you should stop defining yourself or describing yourself with your career first. So now it makes me really think, well, who is Sumeet? He is a veterinarian, but I don't say that anymore. Sumeet's outgoing, friendly, laughs maybe way too much, etc. Loves animals, and decided to make a career out of that. But I think as a profession, we take on so much of the emotional toll from every client. I often describe it as, I have a debit card, or I have an emotional cash allowance for the day. And I may have some left at the end of the day. I might have ran out at noon, or maybe the first appointment in the day left, or it ran out. So you have to find the things that recharge your cash, and you need to leave work at work. And it's the hardest thing to do. It can be so draining. But the more you figure out what is the right way for you to dissociate work from home, whether it's a mantra. I listen to like really silly podcasts about monsters. Like, that's what I do on my drive home. But for me, it's my way of like changing the brain, the way my brain is working, and to rewire it for the drive home so that I can be better at home. Because at the very worst point of the burnout, I was told that I was just like a zombie at home. I didn't say anything. I just sat there quiet for the rest of the day. So I think those are the two things: is don't define yourself as a veterinarian. Don't describe yourself by your career. I think that's probably one of the bigger things. But make a change if you feel like you really need to. Don't be afraid, because everyone will support you. And for students, mentorship is not easy to find. But I wouldn't say reluctantly, but inadvertently become mentors for people who kept sticking around and coming back around to me throughout their pre-veterinary journey. And at some point in time, it becomes endearing, and I take them on. So be persistent. It's hard to say don't be annoying, because sometimes persistence is annoying. There's that fine line, but I do think you need to find these organizations and find these individuals that give you the space to ask the questions. And if you find someone is giving you that space, more than likely they will keep giving it to you. So keep harassing them and they'll become your mentor one day. That's my advice. But yeah, persistence is key, and you have to find these people. They will not find you randomly walking on the street and say, hey, didn't you want? That doesn't happen. You need to get out there, talk to people, meet people, and tell them why you're interested in that, in veterinary medicine, or whatever it actually is that you're interested in. Only by people hearing your passions will they be impassioned by you to get you a mentor or get you to somebody that can actually help you.
Yeah, so as far as I am in 100% agreement of taking a step back from like self-identifying purely as career or profession. And that is something that I think I did. So I did a combined degree program at UPenn. So I think that there was a lot of time while I was like dragging myself through my PhD, where I had a little bit of time to consider mental health. And it is a journey, right? It is a journey. I feel like it's like this layered onion where you continually like unravel pieces or like flipping through pages of a book. And you're ready to learn the lessons. Like you process things when you're ready to process them, right? And that's why it's a continuous journey. So finding methods of processing to go through a process of healing. I listened to a book called Radical Dharma. So it is written by a lot of incredible Black civil rights activists based out of the Bay Area who were seeking more out of Buddhist practices that they were coming across. And that is because in the US, Buddhism has definitely been culturally appropriated in a lot of spaces. And also it was something that was created or written about in spaces where, although there was colorism and caste aspects and classism, racism wasn't as directly addressed in the language. So it is how, and it talks about this component of healing from racial trauma. And that is a very important process for any person of color or other like marginalized ethnic group to go through, right? And that healing is very individual and very specific. And also incorporating that with whatever other aspects of identity that come into that is something that is worthwhile. And if you take that time and give yourself that space, it also helps because we're not only in as like a model minority that kind of pushes through and has those stereotypes and that's cultural indoctrination, but also as a profession, we also indoctrinate ourselves to push through, right? So we have, I think, a tendency to not listen to ourselves or even actually understand the things that we need to reset, to give ourselves that space. So like Dr. Gupta's suggestion of like training your brain or doing something to shift your brain is, I think, a very valuable thing. It's something that we each can learn what those things are, because when you're living the life of a veterinary student, when people ask me like, oh, like what was your ability to navigate mental health as a student, I just like laugh. I was like, I was like, that part of myself was shut off. I did not emotionally process like very much at all during vet school, because it was just you know, like doing the work. And therefore, and like, is that the culture we want to continue? No, but that's another conversation for another day. But then like once finishing that school, then there was this period of time of just like reconnecting with my brain and body. And that still is something that's going on today. I mean, it's been like, you know, 5-6 years. So that would be like my recommendation for anyone in this field, to dedicate some time, because burnout is real. And once you're in burnout, it just takes longer to pull yourself back together, and to reconnect with yourself. For students, I would say, even though you are a student, it does not mean that you are less than. There is this culture within medicine that puts students below, even in just how like the expectations of students, or like the hierarchy that exists within the hospital. Everyone has value. Everyone matters. And therefore, in this context of situations where students are treated poorly, or it's the hierarchy is toxic, and it compounds for people of marginalized identity. And so collective voice is really important. And I see a lot of students doing this type of stuff, and it is amazing and inspiring, and one of my favorite things to participate in. So advocating for yourself is scary, and it's not always going to work. And when you run into barriers that are immovable, understand that it is not your fault, but it is a larger system, and it is not your shortcoming. It is the shortcoming of others in those spaces. So anytime you advocate for yourself and it doesn't work, look at it as an opportunity. It was a practice, and you were coming out of it with having tried something, maybe gotten a new skill or something, and that because it didn't work out, or because someone like because you were reprimanded, or the other consequences, that really sucks, but like it's not on you. And that would be it.
Thank you so much to both of you. I wish I could put you both into like graduation ceremonies of all the vet schools in the world, so you guys can all just repeat exactly what you said. You would have inspired so many people and helped prevent so much burnout. But thank you again so much for your time and your patience and going over everything with us for this webinar. I know that we're a little bit, over our time, but I think it was absolutely well worth it. Thank you, Mel, for staying until the very end, despite wherever you are in the country or the world. I hope you're not missing your bedtime. And then if you guys also do, and for everybody who's listening to this recording, if you do have any additional questions to either Dr. Gupta or Dr. Lin-Hendel, or if you guys would love to potentially have us plan another webinar going over any of the many different aspects of this topic that we did, then I am all ears. I'm always here to come up with new ideas for webinars, and I would love, love, love to have Dr. Gupta and Dr. Lin-Hendel collaborate with us again. So before we say good night or good afternoon for Dr. Gupta for the day, do either of you guys have anything else you want to add before we say goodbye? Dr. Gupta?
Not much.
You sure?
Thank you.
Yeah, rambling.
Yeah, well, thank you again so much. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. You guys have a wonderful evening.
You too.
Bye.